much. So democracy is data-driven. I find this to be a rather unexceptionable sort of comment to make, especially in a forum like this. Right? There's sort of an intuitive understanding that there's something inherently quantitative about democracy. From the first time somebody in a toga asked for a show of hands, we've been counting things. And counting things is part of what we do as a democracy. But as journalists, it becomes particularly interesting when we start to ask what gets counted. And when we know what gets counted, we also know what counts in our democracy. So I work for the Associated Press, and one of the things that we do is we count the vote. We have an elaborate network reaching out into every state, and we gather up the vote across all the arcane systems in place, and we bring it into one nice, neat format that gets distributed. Right? In the process of counting that vote, we also need to gather information about rules, state laws, procedures, right? We need to gather data about past elections so we can know what this one might look like. We need to gather data about how this election might be different. How long are the polls open? What does turnout look like? What are the demographics like? What's the voting equipment like in your precinct? So we have this entire constellation of data that we collect around elections. So the question is, how can we take this data that we collect and other data sets and make it engaging for the reader? How can we increase engagement through this data? Because how we count determines what counts. How do we make that meaningful? One of the ways that we've done this is through interactivity. Right? So we did a project around redistricting, a rather arcane topic that I think is hard to engage readers on. So we took a slice of this data that we collect, and we created a very strong narrative in the interactive. I think this was important. So we had an explanatory aspect to it, right? And then at the same time, and through the same interface, we allowed the user to drill down and see, okay, I can see in North Carolina the way that redistricting might tend to create more partisan districts. And then I can take the same interface and hop over in Illinois and can say, oh, Democrats in Illinois can draw squiggly lines just like those Republicans in North Carolina. So it's a way of finding through the same data set and the same interface the user's story. And I think this is what's really important. What's promising about this massive amount of data that we're collecting is that we can find so many smaller stories in it. But we have to know how to do it. We have to have the techniques and the tools to enable us to discover these small stories in addition to the big stories, and to allow the readers to find their story in relationship to the bigger stories that we're telling. And this is an area where we are still, in journalism, woefully behind. I remember back in 2007, I had just started working for AP in DC, and I'd come from my first elections meeting in New York, and I was pretty wiped out. And I'm sitting on the train, and this guy plunks down next to me in kind of a rumpled suit coming from the bar car, and he asked what I do. And I said, I do data for the AP. And he says, oh, what are you guys doing with predictive analytics? 2007. And I said, nothing. What are you doing with predictive analytics? And he said, well, I work for candidates, and I do data analysis. And I can tell you, if I know where you live, what magazines you read, where you go to church, whether or not you own a gun, I not only know how you're going to vote, but I know whether or not I can change your mind. And I know all those things about you right now. And this stuck with me, and became kind of a big story, microtargeting in the 2008 election, kind of a big story. Kind of wish I'd pursued that story a little bit more at the time. But the parties have had this since 2004, right, at least. And in journalism, this is an opportunity for us, I think, to team up with data scientists in academia and other fields to start to build up our toolkit and our ability to work with the data that we know. So we need to bring more quantitative, and we're doing some of it, right? There are journalists right now trying to do things like determine, was the John Smith who voted for Hillary Clinton in the last election, in 2008, the same John Smith who's voting for her now? That's a hard question, and you need good quantitative analysis to be able to do it. So we're starting to develop that toolkit, but we're really behind. So we're going to have to reach out. We're going to have to reach out, I think, particularly to academics, to help fill that gap. And then in addition, we need to think about political data differently. Beyond sort of the FEC data, which is becoming harder to tell a story with FEC data, right? We need to start thinking about what are the other kinds of data sets that we have access to now, and what kinds of stories we can tell. So these were two examples that I thought were sort of interesting recently. Jack Gillum, who works at AP, did some data analysis using Instagram data, right? So they had a theory that Representative Aaron Schock of Illinois was using campaign finance funds improperly to jet around on private jets. And so they used his Instagram feed and pulled out the metadata and used the geo IDs in there, geotagging, to figure out where he was. So that's amazing. I thought an amazingly creative use of an alternative data set. Another one that's sort of interesting and problematic is the way that a lot of UK news organizations use Google search trends as an indicator of interest in the UK elections, right? And they used it kind of with predictive force. So I think if we can think about these new kinds of data that are available, social data, search data, and we think about these kinds of analytic machine learning techniques and better quantitative analysis, and we apply those things together, we can help tell stories that count for readers. We can help them find themselves in the story and find themselves in their democracy. Thank you.